Among the invertebrates, the animals without backbones, I think we can all agree that from the human point of view, there are species we consider the good, the bad, and the ugly species. Of course, all species are good because each is important to maintain ecological balance. There are sponges, mollusks, and other marine invertebrates that humans use for good purposes. There are the bad actors like intestinal worms and mosquitoes that transmit disease. And there are invertebrates like spiders that some consider ugly. But let's stick with some that everybody might agree are the good guys during this discussion about marine invertebrates, which are some of the most economically important animals on the planet. Did you ever wonder how oysters and crabs breathe, or how they survive and reproduce? We've believed for centuries that our planet's oceans are an inexhaustible source of food, providing easily caught and delicious tasting marine invertebrates like oysters, clams, mussels, crabs, and lobsters for many human cultures. People who learned to master fishing in the ocean's many unpredictable and dangerous environments were able to establish human settlements along continental coasts and eventually across the seas. These biological systems sustain the wealth of nations. Oysters and clams along American coasts continue to provide valuable food, and even pearls, for our society. So these creatures deserve clean ocean waters. Crabs and lobsters are among our ocean's not so creepy crawlers and are also important for us. These marine invertebrates add millions of dollars to local coastal economies, and most humans think they taste delicious. In the Chesapeake Bay estuary alone, the commercial harvest of blue crab, oysters, and other seafood amounts to about $3.5 billion in sales each year. And it's estimated that this industry supports about 35,000 jobs in the local economies of Maryland and Virginia. Landings of surf clams in the U.S. amount to over 50 million pounds annually in the mid-Atlantic, almost 1/2 million bushels. And of blue crabs, a sustainable 50 million pounds in the Chesapeake alone. So a clean and well-functioning estuary ecosystem creates economic activity from these marine resources and creates jobs. That's pretty good. But food crops aren't the only resources we harvest from the oceans. We also harvest sponges. Among the 5,000 or so species of sea sponges, fewer than 12 are harvested for human uses worldwide. Sea sponges are not plants, but very primitive animals with no brain or central nervous system. Sponges are the simplest multicellular animals and arose as aggregates of non-differentiated cells, evolving over 540 million years ago, according to zoologists who have studied the fossil record. The multicellularity of sponges is an adaptive path toward larger body size because many small units allow for greater surface areas to be available for metabolic activities than simply increasing the size of a single cell would not accomplish. A sponge body is an assemblage of different kinds of cells in a matrix, supported by a skeleton of fibrous collagen protein and needle-like spicules. These organisms do not look nor behave like other animals, so it wasn't until the 18th century that they were accepted as animals by zoologists. Sponges feed by filtering plankton drawn in through in-current canals, and their digestion is intracellular because there are no organs or tissues in this organism. Respiration and excretion are by diffusion across cell membranes. Sponges can reproduce by asexual budding or by sexual mixing of eggs and sperm. Most sponges are monoecious. That is, they have both female and male sex cells in the same individual. After fertilization of the egg in viviparous sponges, the zygote normally remains in the parent sponge and derives nourishment from that parent until a ciliated larva is released. In oviparous sponges, both oocytes and sperm are released into surrounding water at a particular time, and fertilized eggs become free-swimming larvae. The free-swimming sponge larvae eventually settle to the ocean floor. Sea sponges then remain anchored for their entire lives. Harvest of parts of these organisms without damaging the anchoring system allows the sponge to regenerate those body parts. Additionally, entirely new sponges can develop from fragments of sponges dropped onto the sea floor. We humans have found lots of uses for sponges, but conserving sponge populations is not only important for our own needs. It turns out that sponges sit at the bottom of the food chain, or food web, in the world's oceans, so their survival is critical to the survival of the rest of the marine animals our economies depend on. Some of these animals eat sponges directly. Others use the mineral byproducts of their digestion and respiration. So when we harvest sponges, it's important that we keep sustainability in mind. The sea sponge industry is absolutely dwarfed by the mollusk fishing industry. Mollusks, or mollusca, are a large phylum of invertebrate animals that includes clams and oysters, among many others. Scientists recognize over 90,000 species of mollusks, and this is the largest phylum of marine animals, with almost 1/4 of all named marine organisms. Although they originated in the seas over 500 million years ago, some have evolved adaptations to live in brackish and freshwater. Today, a large number of mollusk species, including freshwater mussels and snails, live in freshwater and terrestrial habitats. Think about the diversity of this group, from the ocean's giant clam to the small garden snails in your backyard. Diversity in size, shape, color, habitat, and even behavior are typical of the mollusca group, which is normally divided into 8 extant taxonomic classes. These classes include gastropods, the largest group with more than 65,000 species of snails, slugs, conchs and relatives, and the bivalves, with about 20,000 species of clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. The most complex class within the mollusk group are the cephalopod mollusks, which includes octopus, squid, and cuttlefish, some of the most cognitively advanced of all invertebrate species. The giant squid is the most massive of all invertebrate species, at 18 meters long and weighing almost 900 kilograms. These marine mollusks have diversity in movement as well. Octopi and squid move quickly via jet propulsion. And even scallops can clap themselves away from danger, or they can remain glued to a rock in the tidal zone like oysters or mussels do for most of their lives. The bivalves have so much morphological diversity that it is most useful to define them by the features that unite them. All bivalves have a hinged outer shell, also called a valve, and a mantle. And most have a foot or threads used for burrowing or anchoring the creature into the substrate. Oysters do not have a foot in adulthood. The mantle is an envelope formed by the dorsal body wall that wraps around soft parts of the body and secretes the creature's calciferous shell from its outer surface. It remains protected by the shell and houses respiratory organs which develop from the mantle tissue, while digestive and reproductive products are emptied into the mantle cavity. Growth only occurs at the shell margin. How can clams, oysters, and other bivalves breathe underwater? These creatures breathe solely through gills that are part of the animal's mantle. The gills are so different in different types of bivalves that gill morphology is a major indicator for bivalve systematics. Most bivalves are sedentary filter feeders that use microscopic, hair-like structures called cilia within the inner part of their mantle to develop currents. The currents move oxygen along gill filaments. Blood flow is counter to this current, creating a counter-current exchange system for oxygen diffusing into the blood. And these gills serve a dual purpose. Not only do they absorb oxygen from the water through gill membranes, but they strain food particles out of the water current created by the respiratory action of these ciliary movements. Digestible particles are separated from indigestible particles during this action, and gland cells on the gills secrete huge amounts of mucus that envelop any nearby food particles, which then slide down food grooves and into the creature's simple mouth, and from there into the stomach. The indigestible particles are swept away in the water as they leave the bivalve's gill structure. Since the indigestible particles then sink to the bottom, we can imagine the major role these creatures have in cleaning our oceans and rivers. Reproduction in bivalve creatures involves two sexes. For fertilization to occur, it is crucial that as many oysters as possible spawn at the same time. So spawning is cued by water temperature and salinity in midsummer. One Atlantic oyster may produce 50 million eggs in one season, which, like sperm from the male, are carried out into the water with X-current flow from the body cavity. During an oyster's first spawning period, the creature will be reproductively male, and then it will transform to female for subsequent spawning cycles. In Olympia oysters from the northeastern Pacific, spermatozoa in the form of sperm balls are released from the male's mantle cavities. When released into the water, these balls dissolve into billions of free-swimming sperm. Each female oyster filters water through her gill slits and pulls the sperm into a brooding chamber in her mantle cavity where hundreds of thousands of eggs wait to be fertilized. Her fertilized eggs remain in the mantle cavity for another 10 to 12 days, growing and developing. On day 3 of brooding, the larvae are called trochophores, which means they have cilia for free-swimming locomotion. On day 4, the larvae's valves, their shells, are big enough to be seen under a microscope. By the end of brooding, the larvae have complete valves, and finally the creatures we call veliger larvae are discharged into the water column, where they become free-floating zooplankton. After 10 to 14 days, the zooplankton settle on some hard surface like rocks or older oyster shells and secrete a biological substance from their byssal gland that acts like a glue to hold themselves there. These oysters, mussels, or other bivalves that attach to a hard surface as juveniles are called spat. At this stage, they begin filtering seawater and continue into adulthood. A clam's life history is a little bit different than an oyster's. Like oysters, clams are broadcast spawners that release their sperm and eggs into the water in a midsummer spawning where clouds of millions of sperm, then eggs, meet in the water column. Following this external fertilization, planktonic larvae emerge from the egg, then take advantage of available warm season planktonic food. Then the tiny clams float around until they settle on some area. They take about 4 years to grow to minimum commercial size. Some types of bivalves, notably the mussels, have a byssal gland that produces a byssal thread to attach them to a rocky surface. It's sometimes easy to observe groupings of these proteinaceous threads extending from one mussel to another in a mussel bed. The bivalves we call clams, including surf clams, quahogs, and cherrystone clams, are burrowers that lack a byssal gland and develop their specialized foot as they grow. This wedge-shaped muscle can be expanded and contracted so the clam can burrow into soft sand. The biomass of these creatures is as important from an ecological point of view as is the harvest from an economic point of view. During feeding, one oyster can filter over 1 gallon of water per hour, which it does by drawing water over its gills through the ciliary action. Scientists estimate that Chesapeake Bay oysters historically filtered the entire bay's 15 trillion gallons of water every 3 to 4 days. Oysters and other marine creatures' biomass is estimated using fisheries-independent sampling. That is, rather than tracking harvest amounts that may be based on watermen's effort or fishing location, zoologists sample random points around the ecosystem. For example, fishery biologists assess the number of oysters per square meter in randomized sampling locations and track data on spat settling or recruitment of new oysters into that population. Much of the American oyster's historic beds disappeared over the last 200 years due to construction of cities and suburbs along seacoasts. However, some good habitat remains, and here the oysters provide substrate for marine creatures like barnacles, worms, and others. An oyster bed can increase the surface area available to other marine creatures 50 times over what a flat surface might provide. A high density of oysters over a high percentage of their historic range within an estuary and with a growing population is a good sign for the ecosystem as well as the economy. While oysters are an important and delicious part of Maryland's economy, no marine invertebrate is more closely associated with the Chesapeake Bay than the Maryland blue crab. The blue crab is a crustacean. Crustaceans are members of the phylum Arthropoda, which includes their terrestrial relatives, the insects and spiders. Crabs, lobsters, and shrimp are all members of the crustacean subphylum. Arthropods are invertebrate animals with a particular set of shared characteristics inherited from their common ancestor. These creatures have bilateral symmetry, segmented bodies, 6 or more jointed limbs, hence the name arthropod from the Greek words for joint and foot, and most often a hard chitinous external covering called an exoskeleton that is replaced during molts called ecdysis during the creature's life. This hard exoskeleton has been compared to the suit of armor worn by knights of old. It is limiting, and in order to grow, all arthropods need to shed a current skeleton in favor of a new and larger one. The stiff exoskeleton is supported by movable, jointed legs, and these are specialized for different functions, such as the rear walking legs and forward grabbing and crushing claws of crabs. Calanectes sapidus is the scientific name for blue crabs and is Latin for beautiful savory swimmer. In my opinion, this is an apt name for blue crabs that truly are some of the best tasting crustaceans on the planet. Although we mostly associate them with the Chesapeake, blue crabs range all along the Atlantic coast from Canada to Argentina. Zoologists have found that blue crabs live in a wide variety of habitats throughout their lives. Early larval stage crabs prefer offshore high salinity waters. Larvae move into the Chesapeake estuary and use sandy or muddy shorelines, intertidal marshes, and seagrass beds as they grow. To accommodate quick movements in this environment, their 5th leg has evolved a paddle-like shape. These crabs have high tolerance for changes in both water temperature and salinity, so they can survive almost anywhere in the bay. That said, male crabs generally prefer the northern reaches of the bay where the salinity is lower, while female crabs prefer the south end of the bay, which is closer to open ocean and therefore saltier. And while blue crabs can tolerate temperature variance, it does affect their growth rates. Crabs living in the comparatively cold waters of the Chesapeake take about 18 months to reach full adulthood, whereas their cousins in the Gulf of Mexico may be mature and ready to mate in as little as a year. Crabs are meat eaters that feed by predation and scavenging. If you can find it on the ocean floor, they eat it. Fish, clams, oysters, mussels, snails, worms, dead insects, you name it. And that includes eating each other. Yes, blue crabs are cannibals, and they're most vulnerable to other crabs while in the soft shell stage of their molt. Blue crabs are also eaten by striped bass and great blue herons, as well as people, so they rest in the middle of the food chain in the Chesapeake Bay. Female blue crabs become sexually mature following their pubertal molt, then can mate. Just before the molt, females release a pheromone, an intraspecific biochemical sex attractant in their urine, and this attracts males. Male crabs change their behavior when the crabs are abundant and grab more females at this time compared to when they are less abundant and they display to one another. Male crabs protect the females until molting occurs, using a protective carrying behavior scientists call cradle carrying. After the female's pubertal molt, when the female's shell becomes soft, the male will mate with the soft-shelled female. During mating, each crab needs to open an anatomical covering called an apron on their ventral shell to expose sexual parts. The male transfers sperm to the female during the act of mating, and the female captures the sperm, then stores it in sac-like receptacles so that she can use it to fertilize her eggs at a later time. After mating, the female's shell will harden, and the male will then release her so she can migrate to higher salinity waters to spawn. Each female will only mate once in her entire life, while each male will mate with as many females as he can attract during his lifetime. The pregnant blue crabs carry their 2 to 8 million fertilized eggs externally in a mass attached to the abdomen. From a distance, these masses of eggs gathered in tiny hairs under the abdomen resemble a sponge or group of berries. Therefore, we have the terms sponge or berry crab for these females. A female blue crab carries the sponge for about 2 weeks, and when the eggs are finally ripe, she releases them, and they hatch into larvae. Would-be crab fishers should note that it's often illegal to keep any sponge crabs you trap, because they're carrying the next generation of crabs. Each sponge matters because while 8 million eggs sounds like a lot, only about 8 of those eggs will survive to maturity, literally 1 in a million. The target population set by biologists for Chesapeake Bay is to have 215 million spawning age female crabs in the entire bay ecosystem. Even a 20% harvest of that many crabs is a lot of dinners. Habitat loss and increased nutrient loading have been the greatest threats to blue crabs. Reducing nutrient runoff from suburban lawns, farms, and other areas, and maintaining healthy stream and river sheds, as well as healthy seagrass beds, have been important for a healthy Chesapeake and recovering blue crab populations there. Compared with the blue crab, the American lobster comes from colder, deeper water areas, but is just as prized as a source of food. Although a luxury item today, surprisingly in American colonial times, Native Americans used lobsters as fertilizer, and indentured servants demanded that they be fed this cheap and available food no more than 3 times weekly. Lobsters are also in the arthropod order Decapoda, which includes about 10,000 species of shrimp, crabs, crayfish, and lobsters. The chitinous exoskeleton of these creatures is typically dark and turns red when the creatures are boiled for dinner. Lobsters are omnivores and eat fish, bivalves, and other crustaceans, as well as some plant life and even their own molted shells. Like crabs, lobster mating is highly dependent on pheromones. When a female lobster courts a mate, her strategy is to make short visits to a dominant male lobster's lair each day. She delicately moves her antennae inside the rock cave or other lair and wiggles those appendages to smell him, flicks her pee at his face to get him accustomed to her scent, then she moves quickly away. She does this for several days, even if he is aggressive toward her. The male will deliver his own stream of urine when he is interested, and will move his posterior appendages to mix the male and female urine streams and communicate to the female that he's interested in her. Eventually, the female moves into the lair on a part-time basis and allows the male to caress her with his various appendages. During this relatively long courtship time, the female will learn how dominant this male is at his lair, because she can assess whether or not other males are strong enough to outcompete him and take over the lair. Since lobsters have sensory buds on their feet that act similar to our taste buds, the touching within the lair allows them to actually taste one another's readiness to mate. Like all other arthropods, lobsters need to shed their external shell and replace it with a new one as they grow. It's a pretty amazing sight. When the old carapace gets too small, a lobster will drag itself across the sea substrate to create a catch point that holds the exoskeleton and then backs out through the junction between head and abdomen. Or it may start rapidly folding and unfolding its body and just shake the exoskeleton off. After the molt, the lobster's new soft shell is exposed to the water. The best time for mating, from the male lobster standpoint, is just after the female molts, because there is a sperm receptacle under the tail that is shed with the molt along with all of the old sperm. So if a male is lucky enough to mate with a female following her molt, the sperm she uses to fertilize all upcoming eggs is his and only his. So it puts him at a distinct genetic advantage. This arrangement is advantageous for the female as well, though not for genetic reasons. The molting female lobster has a very soft shell and is at the mercy of any predators, unless she's protected by a big, hard-armored, strong-clawed, and aggressive male. So it pays the female to stay in his lair to be mated. And following this hookup, she doesn't need to find another male for more sperm until her next molt. Female lobsters carry their eggs inside their bodies for 9 to 12 months. Then the eggs are carried on the outside, attached by a glue-like substance to the swimmerets under her tail. A 1-pound female lobster can produce about 8,000 eggs, while a 9-pound female can produce over 100,000 eggs per molt. Like crabs, female lobsters carrying clumps of pinhead-sized eggs under their tails are known as berried lobsters because the eggs look like clumps of berries. As newborns, lobster larvae are planktonic. They are meroplankton, tiny baby animals that spend part of their lives as plankton that look very different from the adults of their species, then enter a different niche when older. Lobster larvae float near the ocean surface for 4 to 6 weeks while they go through 3 larval molts and are very susceptible to predation due to their location and small size. Then, after the 4th molt, the young lobsters sink to the bottom, where they look for hiding places among weeds and rocks. While growing, they become less susceptible to predation, and they hide less and explore more. It takes 5 to 7 years, and as many as 25 more molts for young lobsters to become about 1 pound, the normal legal size for harvesting. Only 4 lobsters are expected to survive to legal size out of every 100,000 eggs produced. As adults, male lobsters will molt about once each year, and females will molt once every 2 years. Lobsters can only grow through these moltings. Sometimes they eat their own hard shells after molting, which replaces body calcium and helps the soft shell harden. With each molt, a lobster can gain 15% in length and 40% in weight. Scientists have not figured out how to determine the precise age of lobster, but it is felt that 3-foot-long lobsters may be decades, even 100 years old. Lobsters are so important to the stable ecological processes of the oceans because they scavenge all types of dead animals and their parts. They're also efficient predators that are active at night, and their biology is still poorly known, so zoologists continue to focus their studies on lobster ecology and reproduction. Corals are also important ocean resources. Corals are primarily important because they are the basis of an entire ecosystem, and secondarily because they are a resource to us. Vibrant, multicolored coral reefs surpass even tropical rainforests in their levels of biodiversity, supporting living corals, worms, conchs, spiny lobsters, and other invertebrates, as well as many species of fish. Coral only covers 0.2% of the Earth's surface, but coral reefs support 25% of all marine life. Healthy coral reefs support tourism by recreational divers as well as commercial fishing. Almost half of all fishes depend on coral reefs and similar habitats for some of their lifestyles. The U.S. government estimates the value of coral reefs to the U.S. economy alone at over $100 million. Local economies around the world receive about $10 billion annually from tourists to reefs for dive operations, hotels, meals, and their businesses near ocean reefs. And reefs support fisheries operations valued at over $5 billion per year. Corals are simple, radially symmetrical animals in the phylum Cnidaria. Cnidarian cells include the famous nematocysts, or stinging cells, notable in sea jellies like sea nettles, Portuguese man-o'-war, and our common moon jellies. Corals and anemones are in the class Anthozoa, which means flower-like animals. This class of animals appears in the fossil record over 500 million years ago. The reef-building corals are symbiotic associations between cnidarian animals and colorful photosynthetic creatures called zooxanthellae that live inside these animals. Corals precipitate calcium carbonate from seawater, which helps to anchor them and to build their skeletons, which we call the reef. Reef-building corals require warmth, sunlight, and undiluted seawater. So they are primarily found between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude, in shallow waters away from river outflows and cold water upwellings. That is, they are found in some of the sunniest, most beautiful tropical spots in the world. They require the strong sunlight because that is a requirement of the zooxanthellae living within their tissues. These mutualistic organisms photosynthesize and fix carbon dioxide, and the resulting sugar provides energy for the host coral. They recycle some inorganic compounds like nitrogen and phosphorus that would otherwise be lost to the coral. And finally, they enhance the ability of the coral to deposit calcium carbonate. Healthy ocean reefs are important for our survival on planet Earth because they are a keystone ecosystem. Reefs provide homes to many organisms that our planet needs to stay healthy. If reefs are destroyed, our health will be threatened by the uncertain effect on our ocean's ability to support green algae, which produces 50% of the oxygen on our planet. Despite their incredible value for ecological services and for humanity, the beneficial symbiosis between corals and zooxanthellae is under threat. Over the last century, pollution and climate change have taken their toll on reef ecosystems, particularly in the form of coral bleaching. Bleaching occurs when the zooxanthellae are stressed by the temperature or chemical conditions in the surrounding water, which can break the important symbiotic bond and the algae are expelled. The corals can survive for a few months without their important symbionts, but if they do not get them back within 10 weeks or so, the coral can die. This is what happened on the northern Great Barrier Reef during 2016, when 60% of the northern reef bleached and died. Experts estimate that almost 60% of the world's coral reefs are in danger of bleaching, and the number of bleaching events recorded by marine biologists in the past century has increased by more than tenfold. Although coral reefs occupy only 1% of the footprint of the world's oceans, more than 25% of all marine life lives in these habitats. Without coral, there may be no fish. Without fish, what happens to humans?